Well, welcome to episode 2 of Distilling Greatness. This week we're going to talk about the science of Tennessee whiskey, and we've got some amazing guests. And as usual, we've got my good friend and partner, Jeff Arnett here. How's it going, Jeff?
I'm going great, but I'm not one of the amazing people at the table today. I'm just here.
And that's why I separated it. I was like, we have amazing guests.
We've got
Jeff.
a couple of real scientists here, so we can get pretty deep into the weeds of Tennessee whiskey, which I think are going to be fun. But no, I'm excited to be here. Master distiller and a founder of Company Distilling. Prior to that, about 20 years with Jack Daniels, but proud Tennessean and proud to be here in this beautiful theater again today.
Absolutely. We're coming to you live from the Tennessee Theater, located in Knoxville, Tennessee. It is the official theater of the state of Tennessee. So that's pretty badass. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, a couple of our guests. We've got Kevin Smith to my right here, a friend and partner, and he is our director of Brewing and Distilling at Company Distilling. I like to refer to him as Wicked Smart Guy, but we didn't think that was appropriate on a company card. So
that's right. Yeah.
Welcome, Kevin.
Well, thanks. And I will add that Jeff and I have a long history of working together, 20 years at Jack Daniels. So some direct experience with the topic we're discussing today, charcoal mellowing.
Cool. Yep. Sounds good. And then our next guest is Trent. Trent Kerley is from Sugarlands Distilling. This is the second attempt to get Sugarlands to participate. Greg was here the first episode. There wasn't much participation. He was a little gun shy about the microphone and the camera as well. Trent, basically the bar is low for your participation, so you should be okay.
I love a low bar.
Yeah, so Greg kept it super low, and so you should have no problem exceeding the expectations. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you, though?
So I've been a distiller at Sugarlands for just over 3 years now, and before that, I did my master's degree at the University of Tennessee, studying the effect that charcoal mellowing has on the aroma of whiskey distillate.
Oh. Well, I definitely am seeing around a bunch of experts, so
I'm already out of my league here.
Me too. Like, I'm done, so you guys go. No, I'm just kidding. So we'll get right into it. So again, welcome to the Distilling Greatness episode 2, Science of Tennessee Whiskey. Let's start off a little bit here with Jeff, if you don't mind. Jeff, you were introduced when you got into your master distiller role as the 7th master distiller at Jack Daniels. So being the 7th and then being the time frame, the era of time that you were in, I'm sure there's not a single master distiller in the history of Jack Daniels that answered more questions about charcoal mellowing. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you see that I'll call it from the plain Jane kind of guy perspective, if you would.
Yeah, in the time that I was with Jack Daniels, I spent only about 20% of my time on the road, but I was able to go to 41 different countries in that time frame. Visited most of the U.S. states, but typically when I would get in front of a group of people, I would talk a little bit about the history, the location of Lynchburg, Tennessee and stuff. But when I would start talking through the process, eventually you get to charcoal mellowing, and then people are like, well, okay, is it a bourbon or is a Tennessee whiskey a bourbon or is it not? Where did that step come from? Why did others do it and not do it? Were there other types of wood used? That was a common one. Was it always maple? Or was there some other type of wood that they experimented with? Of course, none of those were questions that I knew how to accurately answer because I wasn't there when all those decisions were being made. But as a distiller and kind of doing the sensory around liquids that were going through this step that makes Tennessee whiskey what it is, you could see some obvious benefits and some very distinct changes that happened in the product. So I could kind of see from a practical standpoint how, over 100 years ago when the technology wasn't quite as good or maybe as understood, where you didn't have access to steam, where it was harder to keep things clean, that you probably had more variability in your process than maybe you would see today. If you were following best practices, you wouldn't necessarily need something like a charcoal mellowing step to clean up the process. But I saw, even with Jack Daniels, and it was very consistent off the still, it was even more consistent after charcoal mellowing. So I think it was one of the great benefits of it was that it tended to address minor differences from one batch to the other, one day to the next. And it made for a very unique spirit at the same time. As far as, whether or not maple was the only wood that was ever used for charcoal mellowing, that was sort of the other common thing I would get asked. Maple made sense, I think, because it's an indigenous wood, even though we're sort of on the southern end of where maple grows. So it's much more common as you go north of Tennessee, but still it's very plentiful here. It's a hardwood that reforests pretty quickly. And when you burn it into charcoal, it doesn't generate a ton of ash. Some woods do. From what I saw, maple burns pretty clean.
Okay.
And that would have been very beneficial in your process because you wouldn't have a way to get it out. So you wouldn't want to be washing ash off into your barrels or whatever, especially if you change the charcoal out frequently, which is, another decision you have to make. But, answered a lot of questions about it. I hope I did a good job of it over the years, but, a lot of it you just don't know. But there's a long history of the use of charcoal. I know we'll get into some of that and all the different uses that it had, over the years. So
there was a comment made by Jimmy Russell, and I'm not name dropping for this. He said this to in a class I took. He said, if their whiskey was so damn good, why do they got to strip it out with charcoal? Can you got any insight of that, or is that just Jimmy being fun? So, and I'm not starting anything. I'm just literally, it kind of came to me. So
I would just say if I were backing a Kentucky bourbon brand, I would have said that too. Because, whether it's true or not, it's a nice dig, right? And,
that's kind of how I thought. I just wanted to kind of confirm that.
And Jimmy's great. So is Fred No.
Yeah.
I think that sort of the camaraderie, but also the kind of poking that you do at one another over your brands as part of the fun of the industry. But like I said, I don't think Jack Daniel's would need that step to be consistent or to fix the spirit. But I would tell you, kind of once you have it in place, it does make for a very unique liquid. So you couldn't take charcoal mellowing out and expect that Jack Daniel's wouldn't change.
Yeah.
So, I think once you're kind of committed to it, you need to kind of do it. So, the early days, it might have been about making a more consistent product. I think today it's just about being a unique product. Jack Daniel's really didn't need that help. And I think, most good distillers know enough about their process that they don't need it as a crutch.
Right.
But you can basically make a very different product by using it.
I think that's awesome that you said it's not a crutch, because I do hear that a lot, especially early on in my experience, early on in my young experience in this, is that it's a crutch. And I never thought it was. Everything I read, the little bit of stuff that's out there, I never felt that it was a crutch. I felt that it was just making a different spirit.
Yep.
And that was it. So that's cool to hear you say that, big time. I think that's
well, like I said,
really
if I were up in Kentucky, I'd probably say it was a crutch, even still.
I just had to have fun with that.
Fun. Yeah,
it's
just fun.
He's a great guy. I just was having fun with it. So I thought that was pretty neat.
I think one of the things you can recognize is that the function of charcoal mellowing has changed over the years, right? So just broad history, the history of fermentation, the 9,000 years of human-related fermentation. And most of that time, it was a mystical, magical process, right? Science of microbiology really began about 160 years ago, where they even knew what was causing it. So before that time, the fermentations were wild and uncontrolled. And so in that time, charcoal really did have that purifying function of just making the spirit potable. Nowadays, as people have gained control, you're actually looking for something different from the charcoal. There actually is some additive process, the leaching of minerals and so on that affect the flavor and the interaction of that spirit with the wood. So we can talk a little bit about that later. So it is now another tool that the distiller has to create flavors and character.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Kevin just kind of briefly touched on there is important to recognize is that a lot of people look at charcoal as being fully a subtractive process, that it's removing things, and it does remove things, but there are things that it adds back in, and those things are measurable and stuff like that. And to me, it actually makes for a more pleasant mouthfeel and things like that. That would be largely missed if you're just nosing it. You might say, well, it's not as aromatic as it was, prior to the charcoal. But I would tell you from a mouthfeel standpoint, I think it's more pleasant, and it may be directionally closer to where you want to be when you're a fully mature spirit. So I often called charcoal mellowing a head start. A lot of these things are going to happen in the barrel anyway, but you're going to allow to happen in days what the barrels might take years to accomplish. But we'll get deeper into all those things that are going on.
That's pretty good. That's good insight there. So take me from a sensory perspective. Not me, but take the group here and our listeners to a sensory kind of overview of the charcoal mellowing and what it can do and does.
Well, one of the things that I, was entrusted to do was decide if something was Jack Daniel's or not. And a lot of that would be based on whether, charcoal mellowing had performed its function. But we actually had sales samples that we created that we put out in. They weren't for sale, but just to kind of prove the point that charcoal makes a difference. So we had before and after charcoal mellowing samples. So these were unaged, just clear liquid. But when you nose the two bottles, they were distinctly different. They were the same proof. They were, from the same distillate, same yeast, same grain bill, everything. But one had a much stronger grainy nose. Is what I would describe it as. It had sort of the essence of corn. Of course, Jack Daniel's is an 80% corn product, so it would make sense that corn would be pretty prominent if it's going to have any graininess to it. But when you tasted it, it was pretty distinctly different too. I often told people it's not just what you taste, but it's where you're tasting it you should pay attention to, because regardless of how you describe flavors, our palates are arranged the same. You have sweet and salty on the tip of the tongue. You have sour on the sides of the tongue and underneath, and you have bitter taste buds on the back of your tongue and throat. In addition to that, everything will have a mouthfeel to it. It can be light, crisp. It can be oily, heavy. It can be like milk or water in the mouth. So there's this savory zone, or the umami that the Japanese refer to it as. But if I were comparing something that wasn't charcoal mellow, it would have a heavier, oilier mouthfeel, and all of its flavor would be predominantly in the back of the throat. So it would have a bitter finish to it. I can take that same liquid days later after it had been through the charcoal. It was lighter on the palate, and it was very forward in the mouth. So you kind of strip away the bitterness that's clinging onto the spirit. And once you scrub that off using charcoal, it reveals the sweet underlying character that the liquid has. Yeah. So that's what I saw from a sensory standpoint. So just, hopefully people would understand. They would go from the back of the throat to the tip of the tongue.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah.
Very cool.
Yep.
Very cool. Well, Trent, you've been sitting quietly over there, which is good. I know Greg probably doesn't let you talk much at Sugarlands. Trent is afraid to bash Greg, and unfortunately, he's going to have to do that before we end this podcast.
I'm afraid to do it publicly.
Well, think of this as a private conversation that's being recorded to be podcast out to a few people, okay? So, no, but in all seriousness, man, hey, why don't you give us what is Tennessee? Tell our listeners what is and isn't Tennessee whiskey. I'm going to throw that one to you out of nowhere.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad I know the answer and don't have to think about it too long. So, legally speaking, Tennessee whiskey and bourbon are very similar. The only distinction is that Tennessee whiskey has to be produced in Tennessee, obviously, based on the name. And also, there's this Lincoln County process, or the charcoal mellowing that Jeff's been talking about, where the distillate has to pass through sugar maple charcoal before it is barreled. And that is really the distinguishing characteristic, legally speaking, that makes it separate from bourbon. Whether or not Tennessee whiskey is or isn't a bourbon is a big debate among a lot of people. I am not going to throw my hat into that ring, especially, in this company. So really what we're talking about is it's bourbon with extra steps.
Okay, Kevin.
I like to refer to Tennessee whiskey as it's a value-added process, right? So, I mean, if you compare Kentucky whiskey, for example, which might not meet bourbon definitions, might reuse second-use barrels, for example, but Tennessee whiskey does require all the steps that bourbon involve, and then it goes that one step. And it's a very resource-intensive, expensive process as well. And I mean, it can be done differently. That's the thing that we're going to touch on too, I guess, is that the Tennessee whiskey law does not really define how you do charcoal or perform charcoal mellowing. So there's a broad range within there, but it is a value-added step.
And just as a reminder, I know we mentioned this, I think, in the last podcast, but there were reasons why the Montlows, who were Jack Daniel's nephews, didn't want to be called a bourbon. And that was because there was commodity pricing being enforced on the bourbon category. So they were trying to create a distinct new category of Lincoln County whiskeys that employed a additional step that were more expensive to make and therefore warranted a better price, a higher price in the market. So Lim was trying to create a different category because he wanted to be out of the box, if you will, when it came to pricing. Yeah,
that's a good point to remember. And it's very unique, I think. Not unique, I'm sorry. It's very applicable to today because as we have the various craft distilleries across the state, over 50, we're all trying to find our niche as to what makes a difference so we can give a new experience to that consumer. And we are allowed to capture the costs and make money off those costs, that value added stuff. And one of your points was about the definition of Tennessee whiskey. And just to touch on that, we're actually going to hit that in a later episode. So really excited to hear about that. So we'll actually Jeff and I, we're going to go over to the Capitol and meet with some people that were part of that conversation. So really glad you recognize that there's some great stories behind it. There's some great things that came of it, and there's some holes that are missing in it, is probably the way I would summarize it. So, but let's go back around here if we can. Kevin, talk to me a little bit, or talk to us about the pass-through. You mentioned pass-through, Trent, when it comes to the charcoal mellowing process. Give us a feel from pass-through, whether it's Jack or anybody else, if you don't mind.
Well, obviously, my largest experience is with that very large distillery that we both used to work at, and the way that it's done there. I think you have to recognize too that Tennessee whiskeys were largely defined by that distillery as well, and the consumer expects that experience based on what they receive from that one company. And so the way that it's done there is very unique and very complex and very complete. You know, the mellowing vats are 10 feet deep. The charcoal is packed into the vat, and then whiskey is flown drop by drop over the charcoal, but it's not on a flooded basis. So, you know, it allows air to exchange and for degassing, and that's part of the purification process as well, as some of that the volatiles come off and leave that. So that grainy note typically comes off in that manner as well. But the time that it takes to do it, the amount of charcoal that's used, the way that the whiskey is, the contact between the whiskey and the wood is maximized, all leads to the kind of that very complete iteration of charcoal mellowing process that obviously defines Jack Daniel's character as well. So. Yeah. But there are other ways to do it, right? So there are some that operate the mellowing vats on a flooded basis, or there's some that have just basically a cartridge where the spirit passes through and it has very minimal contact. But that isn't defined by the law, so the distiller has the latitude to choose how much effect they want the mellowing to have.
I know at least one brand that basically feels like the charcoal is more effective if they'll cool the whiskey down. And that was based on a distiller years ago thinking that the mellowing was working better in the winter when the distillate was naturally cooler. Okay. So they've kind of forced that in the process. So they go through a product cooler before they ever get to their charcoal. So that's kind of their take on how to get the most out of charcoal mellowing, or at least get what they're trying to get out of it. You know, right. we talk about whether there's a best way or not. You know, tell me what you're trying to accomplish, and I'll tell you the best way I think to do that. But there's a lot of different ways you can take the charcoal mellowing technology and kind of bend it to your will. You know, there's science there, but more important, you can use an art to create something unique with it.
That's very cool. You know, talking back to the science, you know, Trent, you were talking about your master's degree there and your thesis, et cetera. And Kevin mentioned the difference, whether it's a flyover as far as the pass through, or it's a cartridge, or it's flooding the vat, which, you know, there's a large distillery that does that. What did you find in your research on that?
So my research was really just setting a baseline for a much larger project that is still ongoing at the University of Tennessee, where what we want to be able to do, what they want to be able to do with the research, is put out all this data and see how the chemistry affects the sensory, so that a distiller anywhere in Tennessee, anywhere in the country, could see how these steps with these parameters affect the aroma. So what we saw, we just looked at distillate before and after charcoal mellowing with a certain set of parameters that I'm not going to get into because I don't want to put people to sleep. And so what we found was that we removed any organic acids, which smell like bad cheese, smelly feet, vomit. Those were completely removed to undetectable levels in the distillate, which is good in the distillate itself. But what's interesting is once you put these compounds into a barrel, they react with the wood and the ethanol, and they go from smelly feet to pineapple, peach, fruity aromas. So we found that it made the distillate itself more pleasant, and we can't really speak to what happens to that distillate after the barrel. The point of all of this is we want to try and correlate these chemical changes, these changes in the composition, with finished product and put it into a language that most distillers could understand. That way they can look at the research and apply these changes without so much trial and error to make the whiskey they want. Because really the goal of it is to help distillers make unique whiskey, because to me at least, and the reason I got into the industry, is it'd be really boring and terrible if every distillery put out the exact same whiskey. We want to be able to put out our unique whiskey, our vision, and then better, worse, I don't like to use those words for whiskey, different, likable. I did a lot of sensory teaching and coaching and stuff, and that's part of my grad school. And I would always tell people, I don't care if you like it. You're allowed to like bad things. You have to understand it's bad whether you like it or not. So it's one of those things, like taste is subjective, and that's why some people like different whiskeys, some people dislike certain whiskeys that maybe get scored high. And that's really the whole thing, is we want to bring the art and the science together and have people be able to take the science, apply it to their art, and maybe save them 4 years making a batch of whiskey that turns out isn't what they want.
If I could add at this point, because I think it's a really important or good time to note an important point about charcoal mellowing and what it might be doing. So in the research that I've been involved with, you were always looking for some of the analytical chemistry data, looking at what changed through charcoal mellowing, what added, what subtracted. And a lot of times we were looking at that to see, how long can a mellowing vat be in service before we had to change that charcoal. But one of the things that you find out, the narrative obviously around charcoal, everybody is familiar with this idea that charcoal can be purifying, that it's subtracting something from the distillate. But what we also find is that these mellowing vats, they used to be called leachers, with recognizing the fact that there was actually mineral from that charcoal that was leaching into the whiskey as well. So in some cases, it can be additive as well. And that mineral, as it comes into the spirit, actually changes the pH of that whiskey. And as it goes into the barrel, that dramatically affects how that whiskey interacts with the wood, that spirit interacts with the wood, and then what is extracted from the wood, the flavors. So it even goes beyond that kind of like the work that Trent's done and the analytical chemistry to kind of understand the complexity of the spirit in combination with the wood as well. So there's that whole layer that is largely unrecognized or unrealized.
Yeah, I always felt like with Jack Daniel's in particular, people would ask me, how much of its character comes from the barrel or whatever. I think one of the things that I saw is that most people would say it's over half of a mature whiskey's character has come from the barrel. All of its color has, if it's using a new barrel, unless they're doing, some type of blending. But, something that's a bourbon or a Tennessee whiskey by law has to be an all-natural product, which is good. So you're using water, grains, yeast, and barrels to create color, flavor, and everything. But I always felt like it was higher than that for Jack Daniel's. If it's, 50 to 60% for the typical Kentucky bourbon, I think it was going to be more like about 70% or more for Jack Daniel's. So it's a very barrel-centric liquid once you go through charcoal mellowing, especially if you get super aggressive, and you don't have to. But the way Lynchburg had chosen to deploy charcoal mellowing, it was a pretty aggressive step. And dramatic changes happened to the product. And then therefore it kind of opened up the barrel to be where a lot of the character was going to be derived from.
Yeah. As the yeast guy, I had to reckon with the fact that even though I wanted to brag about the yeast and the yeast character, that was the contribution there, but it really was largely the barrel.
Yeah. It's interesting you're talking about the how aggressive that application of this mellowing process is. I remember early on in mine 10, 12 years ago, there was a lot of small distilleries that I visited, and some of them would literally have this tube, looked like one of those old bathroom cups where you pull a cup out of the bottom, and they just packed it with some stuff and they like dripped it through. And I was like, so that 7 seconds is making a difference. And they're like, right. Oh, I don't care. It meets the definition of the, so, right. So now that I'm with you guys, I'm hearing, well, there's actually some significance and science behind it. And I think that's good for, I think people listening to us know that, hey, there's some significant science behind it. And to that, you guys, getting to know Kevin over the years here, Kevin is a health nut. He really is. And I noticed in my notes here that charcoal mellowing was creating a healthier spirit. Can you take me through that just a touch? I'd like to hear a little bit about that if you don't mind. Because I need to be healthy. Let's keep that in mind.
Yeah. I don't know if in this case it's going to magically transform you into a fit beast or anything like that. But really kind of what I mentioned earlier, the fact that the spirit, the control of fermentation wasn't very good back in the days. And so really it was really more of a sensory thing, making it palatable, not necessarily healthier. I mean, you potentially say that some of those compounds might not be necessarily healthy that you're stripping out of there, but...
And I don't want to get, I'm leaving the science to the science guys here, but the one thing that I know for sure that charcoal mellowing seemed to disrupt was the formation of EC. And that was one of those things that Discus had asked distillers to kind of measure for it, regulate it, not to exceed certain numbers of it, but for people who don't know, ethyl carbamate, based on things that are in your body, if you ingest that, it can bind with other parts of your body tissues and stuff. And it's known to be sort of a catalyst or a precursor to create carcinogens or cancer. So therefore, the less you can have of that, the better. And that was one of the things that we saw charcoal mellowing do for Jack Daniel's. You looked at what the EC level might have been coming off the still. You looked at what you would be able to measure in the product after charcoal mellowing, and it would be half or less. Of that content. And it was always low, compared to what the limits were. But I always said, a nutritionalist would probably have shot me for saying that it makes whiskey healthy. That's always going to be debated,
right?
Whether it is or isn't. But I would tell you, being able to get EC out clearly makes a healthier spirit.
That's a very modern concern too. Obviously, the Food Safety Modernization Act, realizing that and work with the FDA on reducing the EC levels in whiskey that's definitely one benefit of charcoal mellowing to the Tennessee whiskey field.
Yeah, and I think along that line, you're talking about, having here this purposeful approach to accomplish a goal, and that's either the goal of the creation of a distinctive liquid, meeting, health standards and dropping that ECM out. So the milling process is pretty dang important overall, So I think that's really good to hear, bringing this stuff together, if you will.
Yeah, Trent, what are you guys, I don't want to ask you to divulge too much, but what are y'all's plans for charcoal? I know you've studied it quite a bit, and y'all have largely been in the flavored moonshine space. I know the Romy Man has come out of rye whiskey that's gotten quite a bit of accolades and stuff, but kind of where do you see charcoal mellowing fitting in with Sugarlands over the long haul?
That's still something we're trying to figure out as we go. Right now, we mentioned on the last episode, but I like to say whenever I can, we have the largest pot still for whiskey in North America, 4,500 gallons. Every time I see it, I just get a big smile on my face, like, yeah, I get to run that. That's mine. So right now we're using that to really pump out our rye whiskey, get a good inventory of that, lots of barrels of that for a Romy Man to really go from small batch to larger distribution. It's still something we're kind of talking about is how we're going to do charcoal mellowing for our whiskey, but we do have High Rock vodka that we put through the Lincoln County process. So we label as Tennessee vodka. That doesn't mean anything legally. It's just a fun little thing we like to put on our labels. As far as I know, there's no one else using sugar maple charcoal for their vodka. Obviously, a lot of vodkas go through activated charcoal. But so that's where we're at right now. As far as the Lincoln County process goes, it does definitely make an impact on just vodka, not just whiskey, based on my experience doing that.
Let me pick up on that activated carbon comment, because I don't know that everybody really knows that. So charcoal mellowing is done, at least in its more traditional iteration, with charcoal from burned sugar maple wood, but that isn't activated. To activate carbon or charcoal, you have to actually run an acid over it, and that strips those minerals out. So by not making it activated carbon, that's when it actually has those minerals that do that pH shift and leaching effect that I talked about. The reason that you want to activate carbon is because you want it to become very adsorptive to where it binds impurities and other chemical compounds as it goes through. So it's really two very different goals and ends.
Yeah, yes. I think if I could interject, just because some of my notes here, you're talking about the pH, how it dramatically changes how the liquid interacts with the wood. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, that probably leads right into that if you don't mind.
Yeah, so all these, and predominantly calcium is,
okay.
all these minerals that are in the wood that don't combust during the charcoal manufacturing process are left in there, and they're left to sort of leach out. So when you actually take carbon or charcoal and put it into service in a mellowing vat, the first thing that comes through is a very high pH liquid, which contains a majority or a lot of the mineral content. That settles down over time as it washes in. That's the term they use, as it washes in. After about 24 hours of flowing, that initial surge of mineral comes through, and then you're left with this balance, residual minerals that leach forward over 6 to 12 months of service. So, and it has that shift in pH. So whiskey has a pH typically of about 5.5, whereas charcoal mellowed whiskey can go up to somewhere between 7 and 8 on average over that life of a charcoal mellowing vat.
Yep, and as we were trying to figure out what are the things that charcoal did in the first week that it saw a liquid pass through it versus 26 weeks in or 52 weeks in, what are the things that it's losing its ability to remove, and what are the things that it once imparted that it's no longer imparting anymore, just to establish a life for it. Because I always said that I envision the charcoal mellowing vat to be somewhat like a sponge, and at some point a sponge gets full.
Right.
And, without a way to wring it out, you're going to have to change it out. So you wanted to set those vat changes so that when the benefits it was providing you were exhausted, that you would get it out, but not be wasteful, because you didn't want to be, same way you shouldn't be printing paper that, you're planning on trashing. You're cutting down trees. So you just want to be a responsible user of that. But of course, everything that went through that process got like pelletized, turned into smoking pellets. So none of that stuff went to waste. It either went back and was burned for boiler fuel. It offset like new wood usage. It was a very green process at the same time. But I always felt like, to Kevin's point, one of the things that we saw happening was that it was kind of neutralizing pH. It was going from acidic to slightly less acidic, if not neutral. That definitely increased or cleaned up the mouthfeel.
Okay.
That was part of that experience of sensory that you were seeing. And that was probably the best predictor of when the charcoal was done.
Really?
Was when it was no longer changing the pH at all. It was really, it's time to bring it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting.
I was just going to say that
please.
if you go back to activated carbon, you actually could have refreshed that by flowing acid over it again and making it absorptive again. But that's not, again, what we were doing there. We were actually looking for that more complex leaching effect, which you can't refresh other than putting in new charcoal.
Right. That's pretty cool. The other thing I'd like to touch on is water. I know it's like, oh, let's talk about water, but in all seriousness, because I think we're planning on having another episode down the road talking about water, because on top of being our head distiller, or one of our, or not head our still, I'm sorry, I'm messing all up here. Instead of being our director of distilling and brewing, he's also, I don't want to forget about the brewing part of this. So Kevin's big on water because he is also our head brewer, director of brewing. So talk a little bit, if you would, about just how important the water is and the effect in the mellowing process or in the whiskey making process.
So water is hugely important. And one thing I'll say is that brewers tend to recognize this more than distillers for some reason. I mean, because it ties in so much with sort of regional history in brewing and the styles of beer that developed across the world related to the individual water quality of the locale. But then you come to the whiskey distilled spirits industry in the U.S., and of course you see a lot of distilleries arose in Tennessee and Kentucky, and largely they benefited from the limestone hydrology, right, which gives you just that perfect content or concentration of mineral content in the waters. We used to always talk about how iron-free water was important. I think that's overplayed a little bit. It is important because back in the day when water was used, the straight water from the stream, for example, was used to cut whiskey. High levels of iron could turn alcohol dark. And so you wouldn't want to put it into your bottle and have it go dark. But then more importantly...
Yeah, not just dark, but more like a greenish black color. Nothing like these copper, amber, deep browns that you want to see coming out of a barrel. Yeah. It's sort of a chemical reaction that's just nasty.
Huh. But beyond that effect or that issue... It's actually the mineral content in the water that helps extract some of the nutrients and substrate from the grain. So it's really important to dissolve or solubilize the nutrient to support healthy fermentation as well and complete yields.
Oh, that's awesome. Fermentation. He's definitely a fermentation guy too. We're going to go ahead and touch on that if that's okay with everybody here. Give us a little conversation about fermentation. If you two want to kind of go back and forth in your how you feel about the importance of it. I mean, obviously it's very important, but also just how it gives you some freedom. I think there's freedom in your fermentation processes as well when it comes to in spirit.
Well, I mean, so when you're talking about spirits, it's just like the way I describe it to the layman is making a spirit or a whiskey is making beer and then keep going. So everything starts with beer. So it's fermented grains with yeast, and your yeast strain is very important. It produces different flavors based on the strain. Temperature, I mean, there's so many different variables. I could spend an hour talking about just that. But it's very important to have a good starting thing, because if you brew a bad beer, you're not going to be able to fix that with a distillation or a barrel or anything.
Absolutely. And we often talk about the pillars of whiskey character and flavor, right? We've talked about water, we've talked about grains, we've talked about yeast. The distillation process is, of course, charcoal mellowing adds an effect if you utilize that, another tool, right? We've talked about that. And then, of course, the maturation and the cooperage involved. So all those things are tools that distillers have at their disposal to affect the final sensory character. And you can choose what dominates or what kind of rests in the background, right? So, grain bills, for example, high levels of corn make a kind of sweet, delicate base alcohol spirit. And then you utilize the small grains, the rye and the wheat, predominantly to get those flavors that you want in there and at whatever concentrations, right? So,
but one of the things I always thought is kind of interesting was that, even though Jack Daniel's high corn grain bill, when you taste that liquid right off of, the fresh distillate and stuff, it tends to mask its own sweetness with a lot of bitter elements.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that the barrel was thought to be a benefit of, is it would kind of absorb some of those bitter notes and start to, peel back this underlying character and help that reveal and interact with that and create complexities in how that liquid is going to, basically have certain things removed from it by the barrel and also have things offered back to it from the barrel as it goes, and charcoal is, like I said, just one more way to accomplish that. A lot of the things that you're accomplishing in the barrel, some of those things you're getting, you're doing it in a slightly different way. You're getting a little bit ahead of it. You call it a head start if you want to, but I always felt like it was something that was very unique, and without it, it wasn't going to be the same. Right. I always felt like you couldn't take that part of the process out and still call it the same liquid because it's going to be so different.
So different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Trent, I do need to correct you on one thing. I know you have a master's and all that, but your statement should be that whiskey is what beer wants to be when it grows up. I just want to make sure we're clear on that. Take all your education, throw that out. I'm a business guy, so let's just make sure.
I'll go burn that diploma.
There you go. Do that. Okay. I don't know what you've spent for that, but that's the only statement you need to know. But no.
Yeah, I would
I'm
definitely
going to steal that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would definitely reinforce what he said too, though, because, part of what we've decided to do in Townsend is to kind of take out that traditional mash cooker and fermenter system and replace it with a brew skid, which has a little bit more of a sanitary design. And I feel like if you're on your way to making a great product, a great distilled spirit, if you're trying to make the beer, the more conscientious you can be, the more exacting you can be in the beer making process, the more likely you are to create a higher quality spirit too. Yeah, but we're counting on that because we made an investment in that in Townsend. That's not something we were doing in our past life, but it was something that we learned while we were there. That it's like, if we were going to do it, what's the best way to do it? And that's, even though it's smaller scale, it's the best way. Yeah, for sure.
That's a great point.
I can kind of qualify that and why that's important, what Jeff just spoke to. I think it's not really recognized or realized in the industry how important a high quality or good quality fermentation is, optimized fermentation. I think too many distillers just take what they get. They're not really focusing on optimizing the conversion of those grain starches down to simple sugars to feed the yeast, and then the complete utilization of the yeast to make that into alcohol. And what happens if you don't do that, you have a lot of residual sugars left over. Those go through the heat of distillation and can be scorched and charred and lead to off flavors in the spirit. And I think that people don't realize that sometimes they can go to the liquor store, buy the same product side by side on the shelf, and those two bottles won't taste anything alike. It has a lot to do with the variability or inconsistency in fermentation and those residual sugars going through distillation and leading to off flavors as well. So pursuing that highest yield and optimization, you tend to get the best sensory character and flavors when you also get the highest yields. So that's what you focus on.
Yeah, I always liked that too, because the thing that made the most financial sense to you, to getting the most alcohol out of your grains, were also in your favor as far as creating a more consistent or higher quality liquid.
Oh, okay.
So they weren't at odds with one another. Sometimes
is.
they are, and you kind of get in that juxtaposition of what am I going to say is most important. But in the case of completely fermenting and getting all your starches converted into alcohol in the fermentation process. And Kevin has become a master of, manipulating yeast to help them kind of finish. There's almost any yeast is going to create some alcohol, but only, the best yeast. And if you condition them correctly, you can deplete them all. And if you can do that and kind of predict when that's going to happen and make that your point at which, okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to immediately move it to the still and I'm going to separate the alcohol out of it, is ideal.
Yep. This has been an awesome time talking. I think we all had these expectations in our quote pregame meetings that we were going to have this huge 3-hour discussion. And although it has been short, I think it's been really fun. And I think what I want to say is I would encourage anybody and everybody to please go by Sugarlands, ask for Trent, not Greg. He's not very useful. Probably won't be there. And if he is, he'll be asleep. But ask for Trent. And then if you're up in Townsend, please come in and ask for Kevin. He's there. He's required by contract, I think, is it 24/7, Jeff, or 23/7?
Something like that.
It's something like that, right?
Yeah. It was like I was telling him earlier. I mean, I couldn't believe it. He was like insulting me after all I've dumped on him. Just in the last year. Right. I mean, after all I've dumped on him.
I know.
You would talk to me that way.
It's been an honor.
But the beauty of it is, seriously, like, these guys, not just Trent, not just Kevin, not just Jeff, the rest of these guys and gals on the Tennessee Whiskey Trail that are distillers and head distillers and all that jazz, they're there and they love talking about this. And they don't just love talking about it to hear themselves. They love talking about it, interacting with you and challenge them. I think that's some of the coolest things I've seen in my experience has been when there's a challenge back and just sometimes you pick something up and sometimes you teach somebody something. So I encourage you to go by, ask for Trent, and definitely encourage you to reach out to Kevin and come by there. And Jeff's about to be on the road quite a bit. Tell us where we're heading.
I am. So we've just recently opened up Texas. So I've got my first visit down there to shake hands and sign bottles and meet with some of the larger organizations that we're not currently listed in. But yeah, we're going to be focusing on distribution in a much more concerted way this year. Now that Townsend's open, we feel like we have a storefront, a place to greet people so they can get to know us. So we can shift gears. So the pandemic and all the supply chain issues definitely have slowed us down. But I'm feeling good about where we are in early 2023 and where I think we'll be by the end of this year. So I'm super excited. about what's to come for Company Distilling. We're going to come out with, we were talking about charcoal mellowing. We're actually going to come out with our first product that is mellowed.
Sweet.
Using a different wood finish, which we talked about before, that's one of the things that Company is really going to use as part of our mantra of our process, is that we're going to take woods that you haven't historically seen maybe in the whiskey making process and use those as finishing. So lots to come, and super excited about things that are going on across the entire state, to be quite honest. I know we're going to talk a little bit more in a future episode about kind of how the Tennessee whiskey law got started, how that formed a guild, how that led to a Tennessee whiskey trail, and hopefully people, as they're hearing this podcast, it's going to encourage them to come and visit one of the distilleries, if not all of them. If you go to Kentucky, that's the 5K. Tennessee is the marathon.
Yeah.
It is 30 distilleries and 600 miles from Memphis to Bristol. So we're hoping that people will come in and learn a little bit more about charcoal mellowing. If the distiller is choosing to do that, it's sort of our common heritage step. But the creativity that goes on around it, I think, is unlimited. It's limitless.
Limitless,
really.
yeah, I agree. And it is a fantastic trail to take. I think we've said it in 2017. We're coming up, the trail's coming up on 5 years. Our next episode, we're going to talk tourism. We're going to talk the trail with Charity Toombs. We're going to have Stan Webster in here. He's one of the owners of Postmodern Spirits. We'll also have Nikki from the Tennessee Theater to talk some. So we've got a great lineup there. Future episodes, we're going to talk some beer. We're going to talk some legal history, etc. And we've got a whole bunch of other things to talk about. So we look forward to everybody hearing us and talking to us again. Please reach out. Check out our website, companydistilling.com. Sign up for newsletters here. Sign up for newsletters at Sugarlands. Sign them up. You can't just pick your favorite, and if you do, you'll pick Company. So so anyway, Trent, thank you so much for coming down here. I'll write you a note to Greg. I know you were concerned about that at the beginning about being out of work, so we'll get you a note.
Okay.
And Kevin, thanks for coming down as well. So Jeff, been fun?
Yep, greatly enjoyed it, guys. Thank y'all for your contributions today and imparting your wisdom to us all.
Thanks for having me. I always love talking about this stuff. So
good,
anytime.
Man. Good. Well, thanks, guys. Everybody have a great month, and we'll talk to you next month. Thanks.
Yep.
Cheers.